Good evening and welcome to Indiana University Cinema's virtual screening room. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that IU Cinema is built and operates on the ancestral lands of the indigenous people of the Miami, Potawatomi, Delaware, and Shawnee nations. We are grateful to work on this land and encourage each of you to reflect on the land from which you are watching tonight. My name is Jessica Davis-Tagg. I'm the Events and Operations Director at IU Cinema. On behalf of the entire IU Cinema team, we'd like to thank you for being here tonight for this screening of Dissolution, part of the Nina Menkes Cinematic Sorceress of the Self series, in partnership with the Writers Guild at Bloomington. Our final event in this series will be a Jorgensen guest lecture titled Sex and Power, the Visual Language of Oppression, which will draw on classical feminist film theory to examine how the visual language of the cinema infiltrates our consciousness. That event will be on Thursday, February 11th at 7 p.m., and you can sign up on IU Cinema's website. The screening of Dissolution tonight will be followed by a Q&A with the film's writer and director, Nina Menkes, along with Indiana University Associate Professor Joan Hawkins. To introduce the film tonight, we will be joined by the writer and director of the movie, but to be introduced for her, I will now be joined by Joan Hawkins.
Thank you, Jessica. So it's my pleasure to be able to welcome Nina Menkes to the IU Cinema. This, as Jessica mentioned, this is the result of a creative collaboration partnership grant between the Writers Guild at Bloomington and IU Cinema, and I have a number of sponsors to thank. So IU Cinema, of course, especially the Ove V. Jorgensen Fund and the Community Creative Collaboration Fund, the Media School, Cinema and Media Studies, Cultural Studies, the Writers Guild at Bloomington, and of course the director and staff of IU Cinema. We'll be giving a kind of fuller introduction to Nina Menkes and her work before the Q&A, but for now, let me just say that it is a true pleasure and honor to introduce the writer and director of the film that we're seeing tonight, Nina Menkes, who is one of America's foremost independent filmmakers. So welcome, Nina.
Thank you so much, Joan. That's very, very kind words there. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and joining us here in this virtual space. I'm thrilled to show Dissolution in Indiana. I don't think it's ever been shown in Indiana at all, so it's like a premiere. And to introduce the film, I'll just say it's shot in Jaffa, shot in the Arab area of Tel Aviv. Well, that area has become more gentrified, and the Jews have sort of been pushing themselves into that area pretty aggressively. But the film is kind of symbolically talking about the conflict in the area, and we can talk about it more after the film. One thing I wanted to point out is the way the subtitles are arranged. The film is primarily in Hebrew, and it has some Arabic as well. And people who are not from the area, who are English speakers, might not exactly understand when it's Hebrew and when it's Arabic, and who's talking Hebrew and who's talking Arabic is significant for the film. So I identified the Hebrew language translation comes up as white subtitles, and the Arab language translation comes up as yellow subtitles. So that might help you a little bit kind of navigate the landscape of Jaffa. So I guess I don't want to say too much more ahead before you've seen it, but I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts and your reactions and your questions after the film, and I look forward to the Q&A. So I think we're going back to Jessica right now. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Nina, for the introduction. Please come back, everyone, if you can, for the conversation and Q&A after the film. After the introduction, after I'm done talking, you will see the link to the film on your screen, as well as having a clickable link pop up in your chat. See you after the film, and again, thank you for joining us. Welcome back to IU Cinema's virtual screening room and our Q&A about the movie Dissolution. We will start with a conversation between our guests, and about 20 minutes in, we will start answering audience questions. Please feel free to begin typing questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time, which you can reach by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I would like to start by introducing our moderator, Joan Hawkins. Joan is an associate professor in cinema and media studies who regularly teaches courses on experimental and independent cinema and on women directors. She has written extensively on the avant-garde, and her most recent book is a co-edited anthology on the writer William S. Burroughs. She also writes creative memoir and does spoken word, and she is the chair of the Writers Guild of Bloomington. Please welcome Joan Hawkins.
Thank you, excuse me. Thank you, Jessica. So I'm very pleased to introduce Nina Menkes. As one New York Times article put it, Los Angeles-based Nina Menkes blends mysticism, a powerful feminist sensibility, and a gift for composing beautiful and striking images to make complex, compelling, experimental narratives that often explore the relationship between sexuality and violence. And certainly the film that we saw tonight had incredibly striking images. She began winning awards and grants early in her career and consistently attracts the kind of criticism designed to explicate and explore rather than simply praise and pan. Her work is often described as evocative, which is one of those vague critical words like interesting, which often masks the critic's inability to say anything concrete. But with Menkes, I think evocative does fit the bill and does take on a concrete valence, as it means here films that resonate on many levels, both conscious and unconscious, and images that stay with you long after the screening. She plays with time in ways that you have to ease into, and she demands a commitment from the viewer. She asks that we enter into a real relationship with the film, a form of communication whereby it speaks to us, but we have to give something back to it, a higher form of concentration and involvement. Now, the film that we saw tonight, Dissolution, won the Best Drama Award at the Jerusalem International Film Festival in 2010, and it was a New York Times critics' pick. Certainly the actor, Didi Fire, is just amazing. He's in every single frame, and he's incredible. I wanted to mention also that IU Cinema is also screening another Menkes film, a very different kind of film, Queen of Diamonds, which is about an alienated blackjack dealer in Las Vegas. And it's streaming, if you go back to the email message that acknowledged your reservation for this movie, you should find the link there. And I'll ask Ms. Menkes to say something about that film at the end of the Q&A. But for now, please welcome Nina Menkes back to the screen.
Hi, everybody. And Joan, thank you for that beautiful, deep introduction. I really, really appreciate your words. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have many questions. Some of us just actually reread Crime and Punishment as kind of a prelude to watching this movie. And one of the things that we were talking about kind of over and over and over again as we were reading that book, where there was so many kind of theatrical scenes with people sort of rushing in and out of rooms, and there were all of these crowds, and there was so little privacy. And so one of the things that struck me, having so recently revisited the novel, was the way you really pared everything back to focus on this one main male character. And so I was wondering if you could just start out by saying a little bit about that, about how out of that big sprawling mass of work, you kind of focused in on this one guy.
Well, I guess this is the first time that I've kind of sort of clearly even used a work of fiction in my own work at all. So it was more a jumping off point as opposed to a real, I wasn't trying to adapt it or translate it. It was more like a starting point. And what actually happened is I had a 1 year Fulbright to be in Israel. And I was living in this area, as I mentioned before, it's called Jaffa, or the Israelis call it Yafo. It's an area that was um, entirely Arab. It was the Arab city, actually. Tel Aviv was built, adjacent to it, and then it became Tel Aviv Yafo. That's the official title. In any event, I was there and I was living in this area, and I was just kind of feeling the situation. And I, at the same time, quite by coincidence, was looking for a book to read in English. And I was at a friend's house, and I saw, they had Crime and Punishment, and it was in English. And I was like, can I borrow your book? I just dying to read something in English. And as I was rereading this book, which I had probably read as a teenager, I was just kind of blown away by how much the feeling, not so much the details of the story, but the sense of the guilt that racks the protagonist, and the arrogance of the protagonist, and I don't know, somehow I'm like, oh my God, this is kind of like exactly what I feel around me, and then the other thing that happened, concurrently to that, is that here's this guy slinking around the neighborhood that I saw all the time. And I was like, oh my God, that guy, he's like so much exactly like Raskolnikov. And he's a non-actor. But when I approached him about doing the part, he was like, my whole life I felt like Raskolnikov. So then I'm like, okay, this is like meant to be. I mean, he's just like he's just already Raskolnikov. And so that, his loneliness, his isolation, and that sense of isolation, which is, of course, in all my films, is really, it's not so much that I changed the novel, but I used the novel as more like an inspiration, I guess, to explore this kind of situation that I was feeling. And when you live there, it's really intense. The whole situation is pretty bad.
Well, you said before we started the film, you were telling us, to pay attention to the use of Hebrew and Arabic, and told us, that the subtitles for the Hebrew would be white and the subtitles for the Arabic would be yellow. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because as somebody who doesn't know very much about that area, I was trying to grasp the significance of who were the Arab characters and who were the Jewish characters and so on.
Right. Well, the main character is a Jew.
Right.
And I mean, to me, it sort of evolved that he really is a kind of a symbol in the story for the state of Israel, and he's in this, in this Arab area, where he's regarded, in a fairly hostile way by the Arab men, especially. Right. And then his landlady is an Arab woman. Right. So, and he hasn't paid the rent. These are references to the situation of Israel, basically usurping the land of the Palestinians, and not being willing to acknowledge any kind of debt or any kind of anything towards them. And then there's the little Arab girl who, to me, is she's she's the betrayed, she's the neglected, but she's also the redemption, if he would be able to see her, if he would be able to acknowledge her, which he kind of isn't you know.
Yeah.
At the end, you know, he says, "Give me a sign from God," and it's the little Arab girl on the horse. But you know, does that,
Mm.
is he waking up? I feel like his tears at the end are tears of self-pity,
Mhm.
as opposed to tears of openness or surrender.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then there's the girl on the horse, and then there's that whole kind of flock of horses or herd of horses
Yeah,
behind her.
yeah.
So what say something about that?
Well, I mean, I had actually, you know, the way that I make all my films is very, very intuitive and
Mm,
very, I guess you could say there's a spiritual aspect
yeah.
to my work, to all my work. And I had actually had when I was working on the script, I thought I have to just get out of Jaffa. It's just like, it's kind of really a nightmare. And I wanted to go somewhere quiet. And I went to this monastery, which is
Mm,
maybe half an hour outside of Tel Aviv, and it's called the Latrun Monastery, and it's a monastery of Trappist monks, which means
oh my
that it's
God.
a silent, but they have
Right.
rooms and you can rent a room there. And I stayed there for a couple of days, and it was, you know, very quiet, except you could go when they had mass, you could go into the church and then they would sing and stuff. And like when I actually was in the mass singing, I had this sort of, I don't know if you could say vision, but like vision in my mind's eye of this girl and these horses like
Oh,
running towards
wow.
me, you know, and then I'm like, oh my God, that's the end of the film. And um, so I wanted to have the girl, you know, with like, you know, all these horses, and I wanted them to be black horses. And, you know, I told the producers, you know, I want 40 black horses. And they're like, well, you know, 10. You know, but and then they showed up with all these horses that were not really black, like they had white markings on them. I'm like, no, no. And then we had to like they painted the white marks on the horses
Oh,
back. So then the idea is that, you know, he asks God for a sign and he actually gets a sign. You know, he gets a sign that, and it's this Palestinian girl on these horses, you know, like listen to me, look at me, you know, look
yeah.
at what you're doing. And then the film ends before we know if what his response might be, or you know,
Yeah.
or might not be. But like to me, you know, like I said, his tears are tears of self-pity. They're not, he hasn't really, um you know, he hasn't really decided to listen, even though God is talking to him.
Yeah, it's interesting because hearing you talk about it, it's sort of it's almost like parallel to going to the post office, where on the one hand, you know, he's asking for a sign, God gives him a sign which he may or may not know how to interpret, of this Palestinian girl riding the horses, and then he's going to the post office and talking to this Arab woman, and he has this notice for a letter that she keeps telling him hasn't come yet, and it's sort of like he's demanding this communication which she can't give him.
Yeah. And
Fascinating.
that, I mean, he's sort of like flirting with her,
Yeah.
and you
The
know,
first time, the second
yeah.
time,
Oh,
he's
right.
really
Then he
aggressive.
yelled at her, right? Then
Yeah.
he's very, becomes abusive the minute that she
Yeah.
doesn't just give him exactly what he wants.
He wants it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so was this the first film? I think I read that this was the first film that you had done in HD video HD,
That's
digital.
true. Yeah, I had shot all my films before on film. I started my very first film on Super 8, and then 16 millimeter. And then
Hmm.
my first film on 35 millimeter is Queen of Diamonds, which you mentioned you're
Yeah.
going to be also showing.
Yeah.
And then I made the film that I co-directed called Massacre. It's not 100% my film, but that film was shot in HD, but I was a co-director and DP. And then my film Phantom Love was 35 mil. And then Dissolution was my first film that's entirely my film that was on HD. Yes.
Yeah. So, but I wanted to ask a question about that, but I also wanted to mention that there's a whole retrospective of your, or not a whole retrospective, but there's a focus on you as a filmmaker that's happening on the Criterion channel right now. And Phantom Love is one of the films they're playing. And then it's also Zahara, yes?
Yeah, The Great Sadness of Zohara,
Yeah.
Phantom Love, Dissolution, and Queen of
Queen of
Diamonds.
Diamonds, yeah. So
Yeah.
for people who are wanting to see more that they can't see through the cinema, if you are a subscriber to Criterion, you can see more of these wonderful movies. But when we first start Dissolution, I mean, one of the things that just was so striking to me was the absolute brilliant clarity of the images and how that kind of worked with or against this kind of muddle that the main characters seem to be in. I mean, he's just in this fog. And what we see is just so crystal clear and hard edged and, I mean, incredibly beautiful. But I don't know how to phrase it as a question exactly, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about working with digital, what the quality of the image was that you were trying to get. Was that what you were trying to get?
Yeah, I think that I kind of just shot with digital the same exact way I shoot with film. You know, people. So I've been trained. I've been trained on film. I've been making film my whole life. So even though when people shoot digital, they're like, oh, they're not paying for film every second, going through the camera, so they shoot more. But I didn't do that. I just, I shot just how I would shoot with film, and I lit it the way I would light film. So I think that there are people actually who see it and think that I shot it on film. I don't think it feels really digitally. I hope it doesn't. But the question of, can you make how do you make a film about a muddled character
Mm,
that shows his muddledness or his confusion,
yeah,
his despair, without yourself becoming, muddled. I mean,
yeah,
I think I have my film, the most extreme case of that for me personally was my film, The Bloody Child, which is
that's an
not
amazing film.
available right this second, but it's being restored and it will be available
Oh, I'm
soon, I'm
glad.
happy to say. But that film is a film about the chaoticness of violence and how
Yeah.
confused and chaotic violence is. And I had to make a structure that showed that it was confused and chaotic without the film being confused and chaotic. So I think that's the same with this film. Like, the character is very dark. He's deluded. He's going down sort of into an abyss, and the only thing that could help him is something he's not really willing to do because he's consumed with self-pity. So I had to show that while trying to, I had to show it with clarity, even though what I'm showing is confusion, without it becoming, you know, sort of too clear or something,
Yeah.
something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. And the other thing that was very striking also was the fact that the camera was very static, and then
Mm.
they're punctuated by these zooms, and so he sort of moves in, and I was very struck by the fact that the murder actually happens off screen, that it happens behind this closed door, and then followed by the long segment of him going through her trunk and finding all of these things, or not finding very much, really just finding coins.
Yeah. That I think that that's true of all my movies. You'll see it in Queen of Diamonds too. I'm not so interested in showing the violence on screen as I am in sort of feeling the repercussions of the violence and the aftermath of the violence and the ripples of the violence. And that's also a reaction to cinema, which has
Mm,
prioritized and put the act of violence in
mm,
center stage, especially Hollywood movies. It's always the pinnacle event.
yeah,
So I wanted the film to be permeated with the violence that you feel around that space without, showing the actual violence, And then there's another aspect for those listeners who are kind of more familiar maybe with the situation in the Middle East with Israel, is that, in Israel, there's always a bit of a gray area among, let's not say all, but a lot of Israelis. They feel, very justified in, the bombing of Gaza that happens, at regular intervals, and the shooting of the Palestinians that goes on at regular intervals. So there's always a bit of a gray area between like, is that a murder or is that like justified violence? Like did I dream it? Was that really a murder? I think no, it was a dream. It wasn't really murder. And so there's, I think that was another thing with Crime and Punishment that resonated with me in terms of my interpretation of the situation, where there's this kind of denial on the part of, Israel, that they're doing any aggressive, violent acts. It's always like only the Palestinians are violent, which is just absurd.
I think that, one of the things I really liked about that scene and listening to you talk, I think one of the things that really resonates with what you're saying about the situation in the Middle East is the fact that there is that lag. He says on the hall side of the door, he's saying that he has silver, he has something else to show her, and then he goes in, and there's a while before you hear her scream. And so for me, at least, the invitation to imagine, like, what was that conversation like leading up to that, or what was that confrontation like leading up to that, and which opens up to all kinds of things, like, did he show her something and she offered him a price that he didn't like? Was he already always planning to kill her? I mean, that's all sort of up for grabs in that silence, which is kind of remarkable.
Yes, the other thing, since you brought up the woman, the pawnbroker, which of course is from, Dostoyevsky, but the woman in my film is a Jewish woman. Right. She's not an Arab woman, and there's a violence that's kind of, very present, I think, of the masculine violence towards the feminine in the film as well. In the sort of the more overt story is maybe about this Israeli man, this Jewish man, and how, that violence has sort of, like a cancer, riddled the entire society. And then there is the macho, violence towards women, which is sort of pointed at also, I think, with all these characters, including the fact that he actually murders the pawnbroker, who is a Jewish woman. So I mean, if you want to break it all down symbolically, I mean, I do believe this. I believe that Israel is actually, hurting their own Jewish people by refusing to acknowledge the presence of the Palestinians, and the legitimate what is the word, legitimate demands, I mean legitimate claims that they have.
Gosh, there's so many things. There's the butcher, and then there's the butcher. The butcher is also Jewish, correct?
The butcher's actually Arab.
Okay.
The butcher's Arab. In that case, I went with the reality of the neighborhood, which is that in that neighborhood, the butchers are Arab. The main butcher is an Arab family. They're the main butcher and the Hinawi family, and they have a big store, and they sort of have the monopoly on the butcher business.
The other, when you were talking about, the violence against women, I was also struck in that bar scene where it seems like he's going to be picking, so there are two of them. One is it looks like he's going to be picking up this woman, he's complimenting her eyes, and then he just sort of abruptly gets up and goes over to the policeman at the bar. And then there's the other bar scene where this woman is flirting with him, and then he just kind of abruptly gets up. Again, he's a well, he's a hard character to read.
Yeah. Well, I think he's he's so involved in his own, disintegration. I mean, he's not really available for anything, even a so-called romantic fling, or probably not
Yeah.
very romantic, but some kind of sexual encounter. He's not even really available for that. He's just deep in his own disintegration.
Yeah. Is there a reason why he ends up in a Christian church at the end?
Um,
And it seems like maybe he's trying to do confession and then he decides he can't do that.
yeah. Um, I don't know. I thought that, having him go into like a synagogue, I don't know, it just seemed too corny or something. I think that well, first of all, there's a large amount of Christians in Israel, and there are a lot of
Yeah.
churches. And they, I think that putting him in this Christian church was sort of, I didn't want it to be I didn't want it to be a story of his Jewishness per se.
Uh-huh.
So I wanted it to be about a spiritual redemption that, to me, well, it doesn't happen, but at least pointing to a spiritual redemption that is not tied to a religious position,
Right.
And so since we know that he's a Jew, the fact that he's in this kind of imaginary space, and it's like a Christian church and there's a priest, I think it makes it more that you can feel that it's a space apart. It's not like this guy went into a synagogue, which feels a little too concrete to me.
Right. Right. The other thing was just, I mean, as I said at the beginning, he's just such an amazing actor. And one of the qualities about him that I just loved, were the times when he seemed almost like a pent up animal, where he would just be sort of pacing back and forth or just kind of wandering in this sort of particularly obsessed way. It's amazing. It reminded me of, those stories about the main character in Bicycle Thieves being cast because of the way he walked, but he was a teacher and he was cast because of the way he walked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I saw him, I was like, he's the one. He's just, I mean, no one else can do this role. And that said, I was casting him for his qualities that he had, that were already his. But then, as far as the acting, I had to continually stop him from hamming things up. Like the scene on the rooftop where he's, he's sort of doing this weird kind of dance,
Yeah.
So for that scene, I said, I want you to sort of do this weird dance, kind of, in my mind, it was like kind of Tai Chi style dance or something. So he said, well, I need music to do a dance. And I'm like, okay, what music do you want? And then, he wanted, I can't remember, some loud, like kind of, blaring, I don't remember what. And so I'm like, okay, we'll buy that for you. And we played the music, and then he started jumping around like Michael Jackson. And I was like, no. So, he was like always hamming it up. And I'd be like, bring it down, bring it down, bring it down. And I just like had to keep him from going to where he thought, I'm supposed to be acting, I was like, all you really have to do is be yourself and it'll be flawless, So
Oh God. Well, I see that there are questions kind of piling up in the Q&A. So, Jessica, did you want to come back and we can moderate some?
Absolutely. So we've got lots of really fantastic questions. The first one is from Grace. Grace says there are two important women in Crime and Punishment, Sunya, his sister, and Sonia. It's Dunya, though, right?
Dunya, yeah.
Dunya, his sister, and Sonia, his lover. Do you have something similar that influences the protagonist in your movie?
well, in Dostoyevsky, as much as it's a genius film, it is quite a sexist story. The way that the woman is put on the pedestal in this kind of super unrealistic way. So I think that, for me, the women characters in my film are the abject, they're the abject feminine. There's the abject feminine pretty much in every single one of the women that are around him for different reasons. So, whether it's Malka, the pawnbroker who's murdered, or it's the little Arab girl who's probably the closest thing to the Sonia character. But, she's the abject Palestinian girl. And, she's not put on a pedestal by anyone. So she follows up with, what are the meanings of the long
Yeah,
gaze?
so her next question is, what are the meanings of these long gazes from women in the film? The woman who worked at the post office, the woman who smashed glass in the stairs, the sex worker in the bar, the landlord's daughter watching him running away in the long, narrow alley, even the maid who brought him tea in the room. So what are the meanings of those very long, poignant glazes?
Well, those people who might have seen any of my other work, my work, I've never had a male protagonist in any of my films. All my films are about, these abject female characters, actually. So having the women characters, even though he's the center, but I wanted him to be like sort of surrounded in a way by these women characters, and the fact that they break the fourth wall. I think, to me, it's sort of like they're saying, like, we see what's going on. Like he's kind of wandering blind, but they're saying we see it. I mean, we may be the abject feminine, but we know that we're the abject feminine. Something like that.
Yeah.
So Ava asks, and we're still kind of on the same idea, did you experience any change in your filmmaking focusing on a man when so much of your other work has focused intimately on women?
I feel like it wasn't actually, I would say it wasn't really too much different. I think that whenever I've made a film, whether it's the many films I made with Tinka, or I made a few with other characters, and then this one with Didi, I mean, there's a way that, and I think Fellini said this, or maybe it was Bresson, or I'm not sure. Joan can probably tell who it is. He said, how do you direct your actors? I love them. Was that Bresson or Fellini? One of the
That was
two.
Fellini. I don't
It was
think
Fellini. Okay, so I love them. So I think that you have to love your actor. You have to completely love them, and that's something that is hard when that character is sort of a repellent rattlesnake, like Raskolnikov. So I think that the energy or the dynamic between the camera of like sort of loving him and being revolted by him is something you can really feel in that film. But there's something similar in Queen of Diamonds with my relationship to the main character played by my sister Tinka. Like she's like there's a love or a desire to connect with that character, and then there's like I can't get too close because maybe she's scary on some level. And I think that in a way is very similar with the characters in Queen of Diamonds and in Dissolution.
Next question is from John. John asks, could you talk about your crew for the film? Was it a mix of Israeli and Palestinian men and women? And if so, were there any inherent tensions on set?
The film was shot in Jaffa. The producers were Israeli Jews. I do my own camera work, and I write, direct, and shoot. I worked with a DP who was sort of in charge of the lighting, but I do all my own camera. The DP was an Israeli Jew. The line producer, Tony Kopti, and many of the sort of the PAs were Palestinian from that area, and there was no weird vibes that I felt at all. I think that they were, first of all, quite in, shall we say, they were in alignment with the message of the film. And they were very supportive of me. Because of discrimination in Israel, you see that, with the exception of the line producers, the Palestinians didn't have significant positions. I was not, I think if I had maybe lived there longer, I was just a temporary person, maybe I would have tried to get more Palestinian participation at higher levels. But the line producer was Tony Kopti, who I'm actually still in touch with, and hope to make another film with him as producer about the situation there. So yeah.
Absolutely. David asks, there seem to be some echoes of Bela Tarr's work. Is he an inspiration or influence from your work? And what are some of your other influences?
I love Bela Tarr's work. I mean, I take that as a compliment. Absolutely. I think he's a fantastic filmmaker. Satan Tango is one of my all-time favorite films on earth. My influences, I mean, I have to say that, when I started my filmmaking, I really almost tried not to see too many other films because I had a very strong feeling about what I wanted to do, and I was afraid I would be influenced, especially as a woman, and especially what I was trying to do. I didn't want to get influenced. But the films that I saw, like after my film Magdalena Viraga, I saw Jean Dielman, which blew me away, by Chantal Ackerman. But I did see that after I had already made a couple of films. So, I saw Tarkovsky films that influenced me a lot. I mean, Antonioni and probably more influenced by painters and writers than other filmmakers. Like I was very influenced by the existential writers and Camus, which you'll notice, my mother died today was a direct quote. And, hat tip. And also Gertrude Stein has been a big influence on me as a writer. And then the surrealist painters and photographers, including Max Ernst and Frida Kahlo, Remedios Varos, and all of those people in the surrealist movement. So, which, women were sort of suppressed, but I still align myself with the surrealist movement as sort of very central to my work.
Next question, AE asks, certain motives seem to reoccur in several of your films: isolated people, people standing around accidents, insects and animals in domestic spaces, and rings in fishes. Can you tell us why you gravitate toward these moments?
Yeah, that's very observant. Well, the thing about, scenes of accidents, I think that, ties back to what Joan was saying before, because I'm interested in this sort of aftermath of violence, not the violence itself, but that sort of the ripple effect, or the impact of that violence on a space or on people after it's happened. But you're absolutely right. There's, the scene in Queen of Diamonds and the scene in Dissolution. I never thought of that, but those are definitely, there's a similarity there. And the fish and the ring, well, that's more obvious that that's something I've come back to. I particularly love that because I feel that it's from a fairy tale. I don't know what fairy tale, but it's an image from a fairy tale. But I love the idea that that God speaks in these mysterious ways to the characters, so that they are both in different ways. Like in Queen of Diamonds, you see it too, but I won't say anything, and I won't do a spoiler on Queen of Diamonds. But since you've seen Dissolution, I mean, it's the ring from the pawnbroker that's coming to haunt him. So, the fact that it appears in this particular fish on his particular plate makes him fear God, it's like, and then intensifies his sense of guilt. So I'm very much enamored of fairy tales, but using them in ways that, still cut against the grain.
All right, I think we have time for one last audience question, and then I know Joan has a final question she'd like to wrap up with. Grace asks, can you explain the symbolic intention of the scene when the protagonist was sharpening his knife to the rhythm of a piano meter? Was it a piano meter?
Oh, it was a
Metronome.
Metronome.
Yeah. Well, the idea of sharpening the knives, I mean, it's also very much, the Israelis and the Palestinians, they're sharpening their knives, they're getting ready to kill each other, and maybe just, identifying him as a potential murderer. And, the metronome, I don't quite remember. I think that, this guy, Dee Fire, he's a musician, and he actually just had this metronome in his room. That's actually his room.
Fantastic.
That's his room.
Oh my God.
And he, so he was like, I'll do it to the metronome. And it was his idea. And I loved it. I thought, oh, that's great. I love it. Yeah, that was the idea of the knives.
So I wanted to see, am I on? I wanted to wrap up by asking you to say something about Queen of Diamonds for people who hopefully can use their link to see the film, and also whatever you would like to say as a kind of preamble to next Thursday's program, the Sex and Power Talk.
Sure. Well, Queen of Diamonds is a film I made in 1991, and it was recently re-released. Last year it was re-released, and actually got kind of, I have to say, rave reviews. And I mean, this film, it's a pretty radical experimental film, and I'm kind of astonished that people have decided to love it now. It was a sort of one of these films that splits audiences. A lot of people walk out, but the people who stay are probably people who love it. It stars my sister Tinka, who's brilliant. So it's a film that's very beloved to me, but I probably shouldn't say that because I guess all my films are beloved. But this film is about Las Vegas, and the interesting thing is it was restored, which I'm very grateful for. It was restored by the Academy Film Archive and by the Film Foundation. And we had the premiere of the restoration at the AFI Film Festival in I think it was 2018 or 2019. And I watched it, I sat in the audience and I watched it, and I was kind of, I have to say, I was kind of stunned, because I'm like, this film could have been shot last year. It doesn't feel like a film from 27 years ago. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And would you like to say something about the Sex and Power Talk?
Yeah. So next week we're going to do this talk that I actually, this talk is something that I've been giving over a period of like 20 years. I've given evolving forms of this talk to my students. And after the Me Too movement erupted in 2017 with Harvey Weinstein New York Times article, I wrote an essay for Filmmaker magazine. And I was saying how the visual language of cinema is tied to the epidemic of sexual assault, sexual abuse, and to the employment statistics with women directors. Like, these are all one. And this essay that I wrote, amazing to me, went viral. And after it went viral, I started getting invitations to give the talk publicly. And I've given the talk publicly kind of around the world. And in fact, I was very amazed and thrilled and grateful to get money from Tim Disney and Abigail Disney and Susan Disney Lord to make the feature film version of this talk. And I would refer people, if you want to give people the link, it's brainwashedmovie.com. If you go to brainwashedmovie.com, there's a 4-minute teaser there for the film. But the point of watching the teaser is if the teaser intrigues you, then come see the talk, because the talk is like the basis of the film. And it really has, it's primarily a critique of kind of more traditional kind of films in terms of shot design, but certainly my own films are in dialogue with all of those traditional films. So my own work is very, interconnected to this whole sex and power talk, which refers to more, the Cannes winners and the Academy Awards and those kind of movies.
That's great. So I hope to see a lot of people here next week for what promises to be a very interesting evening. And tell your students to come, people. We so often, we're teaching many of the theorists that are discussed often in relationship to this talk. And then there's all this wringing of the hands of like, where can we find more contemporary things? People often don't, students often haven't seen a lot of Marlene Dietrich movies and don't relate to them in quite the same way. And so it'd be wonderful for people to see them and to tell their students to come.
Yeah, I'm excited to continue our discussion next week.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. So, Jessica, do you want to take us out?
Yeah, thank everyone else out. Is Joan, Nina, you have any last comments you wish to make?
Just that I really enjoyed everything about the evening. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful movie. I hope people see Queen of Diamonds, and I hope people come back next week for more.
And I just want to thank Joan, Jessica, everybody on the Indiana team for inviting me, for showcasing my work, and for being so great. So, and thanks to the audience for coming out.
Great, thank you. And thanks to the Writers Guild.
Absolutely. And thank you, Joan, Nina, and again, all of you in our audience for being with us. I would also like to thank the entire IU Cinema team, particularly Brittany, Seth, Elizabeth, Will, Ava, and Carla, who have all worked behind the scenes to help make this event possible. We'd like to encourage you to go to IU Cinema's virtual screening room to see our events and other offerings, as well as signing up for our weekly email to take advantage of IU Cinema's 10 Years, 10 Films, 10 Perspectives series, which features 10 specially curated free films this semester for our email subscribers. Currently running movies are Beau Travail and The Hitchhiker, and Grey Gardens will begin its run next week. To all of you who tuned in, thank you once again for being with us. Be well and be kind to yourselves and others during these challenging times. Thank you all so much and have a great night.